later on. And I fell in love with all those Janáček operas, and I said, one day when I will be a general director, I will also do a Janáček cycle of that time when I will be that general director. Of course, in Düsseldorf at that time, all the operas were sung in German in the translation of Max Brod, because these operas at that time were really quite unknown even in Germany. And so that's why I, years later in Antwerp, as said Nicholas Payne, I started a Janáček cycle with Robert Carsen. We did Jenůfa and Katia Kabanova and a first version of The Cunning Little Vixen. And then I moved to Strasbourg, and then we did Macropolis Affair, a second version of The Cunning Little Vixen, and From the House of the Dead. So Robert staged the 5 main operas by Janáček, and I'm very pleased that he is at my side now to talk about how should we stage Janáček today, as well as David Pountney, whom I know for years already, and David Radok, who is the director of the Macropolis production you will see tomorrow night, I think. So we were asked to speak also mainly about Macropolis, but I think it's important to place this work in the total oeuvre of Janáček. So with whom shall I start now? The career of Janáček was quite long, and his main works were nearly all created during the last 15-20 years of his life. Biographs often distinguish 2 periods. First, a more folkloristic, ethnographic period in which he defended the rights of the Czech music against more German influences, and a second period, which was the last 10 years of his life, where he created such important work like Katia Kabanova, The Cunning Little Vixen, Macropolis and The House of the Dead, all within a period of 10 years. So could we first perhaps speak about what was the reason that he took so long actually to come to these main works in the last 10 years of his life? Do you have an idea of this, David Pountney?
I don't have an idea of that precisely. Is that working? No.
No, you have to push.
I don't have an idea what held him up precisely. It seems to me that he was psychologically enormously motivated by the possibility of Czech independence, and I think that seemed to fire him up in an incredible way, because it's an extraordinary lifespan, really, where he spends 50 years kind of being, relatively speaking, a nobody, and then suddenly a short period at the end of his life producing all these great masterpieces. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, because I think that's very interesting for a director, are the enormous structural differences between the pieces. And basically, to me, there are 2 types of opera that Janáček creates in his 7 main titles. And he starts with something relatively conventional, which is Jenůfa, which is a 3-act drama with a linear storyline, a beginning, a middle, and an end, and it's quite a traditionally constructed piece. And he then goes off on a completely wild period of experiment where he tries what I call his cinematic collage style. So Osud is a completely non-linear plot. It's not even, there isn't really a story there at all. It's a series of glued together fragments and associative atmospheric moments. It's almost more like an opera that relates to a James Joyce novel than it does to a linear story. Amazingly adventurous. Something that gave him great problems. And he then actually was carried on in that vein with Broček, which is this double satire, an incredibly complicated dramaturgical idea to realize. It took 7 librettists, I think, to fail to come to an ideal solution to that piece. And then, there's no evidence for this is purely my speculation. I think he thought, oh my God, this is going nowhere. I'm not succeeding in bringing these pieces. And he goes back to a well-made play, which is the Copacabana, which again is a 3-act play with a very coherent dramatic structure, and it's written like a good play, and it has a very clear story, and there's none of this associative cinematic collage. And then he branches out with Vixen, which again is what I would call cinematic collage, and then he goes back again to Macropolos' case. So he's pacing himself, it seems to me. He's pacing the amount of radical invention he can actually deal with. And then he finally ends up with the most radical of all, which is The House of the Dead, which is an amazing dramaturgical achievement. And it's so difficult. I know I shouldn't go on too long, but the really interesting thing is, and I've looked through John Tyrrell's book very carefully in relation to this, Janáček had no models. There was absolutely nobody he could model these cinematic collage pieces on that came out of his own head. There was nothing going on that he knew, because he had very limited experience, actually, of other work that was going on. And so he invented all of this out of his head. But that, I think, gives us directors two wildly different styles to deal with.
Robert, you once said Janáček is absolutely a modernist in the choice of his theatrical subjects. What did you mean with that?
Hello. Did I really say that?
Yes, you said it.
I have absolutely no idea what I meant by that. I would just like to say that it's really special to be sitting here with David Pountney because having this conversation because, and I think it's appropriate that each one of us, you and Nicholas Payne, we all have a sort of personal story about Janáček, and I came to the United Kingdom as an actor from Canada, and I wanted to see what the inside of the Royal Opera House was like, and I was studying in Bristol at the Old Vic, and I came up to London, and there was this very strange thing that I'd never heard of that was being performed called a Yenufa. And I was determined to see what the theatre was like, so I got a ticket and I went in and I was completely amazed by what I saw and what I heard. Now, this was not one of David's productions, but after that I then saw many, many works, mostly directed by him, and he's done an incredible amount for this, as you all know. When I was working with Marc and we discussed what we might do after we'd done another cycle before this, it seemed absolutely essential for me to be able to do Janáček. I mean, I would have to say that personally this is my favorite composer in terms of theatre. As David was also saying, he's a sort of a school of one. You can't compare him to anything, and he didn't come from something the way you can imagine Puccini coming out of Verdi or whatever. There's really absolutely nothing to compare him to. And what I think is so unique in all the different works is his singular ability, which opera is always about anyway, of the way in which the alchemy between the intellect of the word is tempered by the emotion of the music. And Janáček had a completely unique way of doing this. I'm not a musicologist, so I'm not going to say which way his musical intuition worked in terms of dramatically, but since he fashioned so often his own librettos and cut them so radically, I mean, one of the other things that's amazing about his works is that they are comparatively short, even the 3-act operas, and unbelievably intense. And it doesn't matter to him necessarily whether it always makes sense what you're hearing. And there are bits that are left out from certain plays or stories. I mean, the Macropolis case is actually almost meant to not be comprehensible, the first act, because you just can't assimilate the whole law suit, and that's not what he wants you to do either. It's an amazing world that he creates, which also by his extraordinary ability as an orchestrator as well as a composer manages to draw the audience instantaneously, I would almost say, into the world where he wants to go. There's no gentle introduction, a door opens and you're there. And it's always absolutely thrilling. And it's, for me, this music and theatre are held in a really miraculous balance. It's a different energy and a different event with each of the pieces, at least the pieces that I've been able to work on, but there is still always this amazing, uncompromising, unglamorous, uncosmetic approach to composition. It is an emotive but a very strongly intellectual response to the situations, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why we love him so much.
David Radok, you are staging now Macropulos, and Janáček was still working at the Cunning Little Vixen when he saw the play by Karel Čapek, when he was very inspired by this incredible woman that is Elena Macropoulos or Emilia Marti, all the names she bears during her 337 years life. But can one imagine that a composer that is working on the Cunning Little Vixen, which is an history about a very melancholical history about animals in the woods, is suddenly impressed and attracted by such a subject like Macropulos? These two subjects are very, very different from each other.
Good afternoon. I don't think they are so different, in fact, because I think that the Little Cunning Vixen is dealing with sort of the basic human emotions, and it actually raises a question about what are the values of human life. And I think that the Macropulos case is dealing with the same theme, in fact, because it raises the questions about the relativity of values and the relativity of time. And both the relativity of values and time is closely connected. And in Little Cunning Vixen, it's almost, well, it's not the same story, but it's almost the same questions. And by relativity of values, what I mean is that that we are all mortal. We know that our time is limited. We don't know when we're going to die, but we know that there is an end. There's a beginning and there's an end. And the question is, how should we fill the time with the things which are valuable, which are not just the fake values? Because in the Macropulos case, you have little Krista who wants to be famous. She's young. Her goal in life is to be famous. You have Gregor who wants to get his 150 million and his coal mines. He wants his money. You have Bruce who belongs to certain social class. And that is the aim of life. And all these people actually at the end of the opera realize that the values which they were thinking were the most important are not important. And it's also funny, I think, that strange, this opera, because it's one of the very few operas where you have the main character who doesn't really come to any catharsis or goes through any, she doesn't evolve. I mean, the only thing that happens with her is that at the end she says, I don't want anymore, I want to die. But all the other characters somehow change. And I think it raises a question, how should we spend our time here? And I think that it's, if I may mention this, this Monday we were celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic. And I mean, everybody was asking, what have we done with the time? what was the values of the society, of the free society. And the result is really sad. Because the real values were exchanged for fake values. For the sausages, the fancy cars, and the summer houses. And it's because I was working on the Macropolis case, I was just last Monday just thinking really it's what are the values?
This person, Elina Macropoulos, Emilia Marti, Eugenia Montes, all the names she has, is, as you said, a person that first wants the longevity and then comes to the insight that she has lived enough. Are there other persons in theater history? I think of some male persons like Faust, who is also dreaming of longevity. Another person who is living many lives is, for example, the Flying Dutchman, who is condemned to live many lives. But can we think of one woman in theater history like Elina Macropoulos?
Well, I have to disagree with one thing. You said that she wanted longevity. She never did want longevity. She was used as a child experiment to try out a formula that nobody knew whether it would work or not, and that condemned her to.
Yes, but in the beginning of the opera, she wants absolutely to have the formula.
She's scared of death,
like
anybody else.
Yeah.
But I wondered whether it was interesting to look at, also from our director's point of view, one of the things that Janáček does at the end of the Macropolis, which he does at the end of Yennefer, he does at the end of Cunning Little Vixen, he does at the end of Katja, he does at the end of The House of the Dead, is that you've been going along with this story, whether it's a realistic story, as in those well-made dramas, or whether it's this cinematic collage, and then suddenly, in the last 5 pages, he explodes the whole pot, and he goes... And you are faced with a real problem as a director. Is how do you go there? How do you because Janáček brings this apocalyptic, universal vision to the end of all these stories. However absurd the story of Macropolis may be in its factual sense, suddenly at the end you feel that you're entering into a universal dialogue with spiritual truths and with God, and as you do at the end of Yennefer. This is why German directors can never cope with Yennefer, because you suddenly got 10 pages of blazing optimism at the end at the end of Yennefer, and nobody knows what to do. They're all terrified of it. So they had to have the villagers come on and stone Glatzer and Yennefer to death, because it's too awful. 10 minutes of glorious optimism. But Janáček actually was an optimist.
Yes. But you didn't answer to my question. Are there other persons in theater history that remind you of such a person, like Elina Macropoulos?
I can't think of another one. Offhand, no, not another woman.
Neither do I. But, we are all want to be immortal. That's why everybody is jogging and eating vegetables and avoiding meat and driving safe Volvo cars and so on. Who doesn't want to be immortal? But as what's his name? Bernard Williams says that it's our mortality that gives life its meaning. If we were not mortal, we wouldn't do anything. We would just say, well, I'll do it in next century. So it's... at least I would. I wouldn't do anything.
But that's in fact what she says too.
Yeah.
At the end she says, you're lucky because, this all means something to you because it's not going to last. And of course that is, I think it's what's interesting also is how the opera libretto, of course by being set to music, changes from the actual deep irony and really crazy, almost crazy quality of the play, which is, like so much of what Čapek wrote, really amazing. We have to remember the inventor of the word robot. the extraordinary creations that he had in his mind, and that Janáček, even seeing this play, would somehow think that this could be made into an opera. And again, I think he does something so brilliant where, you know, you get that amazing beginning, that thrilling beginning musically, and then the music becomes very brittle and strange for quite a long period while we're sorting out this problem, which has a certain tedium in it to do with the actual discussion about time going by. And she's, of course, because of her fear of death, she is a victim. I mean, it's true. She's a girl, aged 16 or whatever she is, just forced by her father to drink this in front of Rudolf II, and of course she falls in a coma, so they think she's dead, so he's punished, and a week later she comes out of it and then begins this life where she doesn't even know what has happened to her or what indeed is going to happen. And I think also, when I worked on it, what I thought was very interesting is that, going back to what you're saying about the length of this, well, it isn't immortality, is it? It's like mortality with a much longer, with a completely different end to it, 300 years later. But as she develops who she's going to be and then has to learn to cope with who that is, that means that after a certain point everyone begins to wonder why she doesn't get any older looking, and something's odd. So before people can challenge her, she leaves and takes another identity and has to reinvent herself and go to another place and take another name, and it's always EM. And she's always, and this is what I think is so interesting, that she was chosen to be an opera singer. So you have, like you have in the construction of Tosca, where in an opera I was watching an opera about an opera singer. So that not only does she play characters in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, she's also living through those periods. So you have somebody, if you start to think about it, who actually knows exactly what she's playing. And of course it's very amusing in the law case when she actually says, no, it wasn't like that at all, or I know exactly where the will is, because she was actually there. But it's interesting to think of it in terms of the theatrical presentations, that she would be part of as well. So it's very complex, but of course all the way through she has become completely indifferent to what normally motivates us. And in fact, what she was saying, the motivations of the other characters she doesn't want anything anymore, but she hasn't actually realized that. She just sees the uselessness of everybody else's desire of her. She's like a Garbo or Dietrich or some incredible movie star that consistently has to deal with all this desire being thrown at her mindlessly. And that's this. I think you're right also to talk about this culture of celebrity and instant gratification. I think it's a warning for many, many things about what you want to build your life on. And she does come to. There is a cathartic change when she realizes that in fact she doesn't. All that trying to get the formula, suddenly she doesn't really, she's got it, but she doesn't want to start all over again.
Yes, because Janáček changed the drama by Čapek. At the end of the drama by Čapek, she's like in a sort of philosophical thinking about death and life, whereas with Janáček, she really decides, now I want to die. So, and that gives this fantastic finale where the music becomes much more lyrical also than before.
Well, I think the point is what I was trying to make in all those pieces, which is why I think they're challenges for a director, is that in the last pages, the music totally takes over. And the end of the Macropolis is not a philosophical conclusion, it's a musical conclusion. The end of Yennefer is a musical conclusion. And that, and if you're lucky as a director, given that you're dealing with bits of wood and actors and things, you maybe contrive some way of going on that journey with the composer, which is saying, we've told the story, now we're leaving the story behind, and we're going to soar away into some fantastic humanitarian, universal message, which is what makes those pieces so inspiring.
Karel Čapek, you mentioned it already, Robert, was in a certain way one of the first writers who wrote science fiction pieces, and he invented also the word robot. Would you call Macropolis a science fiction piece?
Well, I wouldn't know I wouldn't, because I think that the immortality is only a pretext for telling the story. And I think there's one big difference between Čapek and between Janáček, is that Čapek wrote a comedy which polemizes, though. It's a polemical comedy about if it's good to live long or too short, or if the life is better if you live 300 years because you can achieve more, and so on and so on. But I think Janáček changed it. Janáček made, I would dare to say, maybe existential tragedy out of it. And I mean, I don't want to say anything wrong about Čapek, but in Čapek you feel the idea all the time throughout the piece. You feel the idea why the play was written. And I think that in Janáček he took away everything that he didn't need, because the music could tell. And he actually, he made it much shorter, much more economical. And I think it's, the play lives through Janáček, not through the play itself, I think. Although it's not a bad play, but it's a bit, you feel the paper in it somehow. I'm sorry, maybe.
No, you're right.
Maybe
It's
I
a
shouldn't
hook.
say it in front of Czechs, but
The whole device of the paper and the formula and the longevity is a hook, and it's a hook to hang on a discussion about the importance or the essentialness of death. So, if in the Cunning Little Vixen, as you rightly said, he's taking the cycle of life to affirm that death is part of life. It's just another segment in that wheel that's going round and round. And then in the Macropolis case, he celebrates the fact that death is an absolute necessity for a sane human existence. If we don't know we're going to die, we'd all go bonkers. It would be a nightmare. So he's saying the most terrifying thing, which is that we're going to die, is actually something that's absolutely essential to our humanity.
Yes.
And that's what that piece is saying. And then in The House of the Dead, he goes on to say, and in the midst of absolute death on every corner, the human spirit triumphs and will salvage a scrap of life and humanistic assertion. And so, he's an old man, and he's writing all this wonderfully affirmative stuff at the end of his life. It's great.
You mentioned already that Elina Makropoulos, when the drama plays, so in the period of her long, long life, that we see her going on stage, she's an opera singer. And in your concept you made with me in Strasbourg, this was one of the main issues, I would say, in your production. Could you say something more about that?
Yes, it seemed important to me because of the fact, not just because of the fact that she is an opera singer, although no role is ever mentioned, actually. The second act, the first act, which is set in this lawyer's office, and then the second act takes place just after she has triumphed in some performance of something, and it's set backstage, I think. And it seemed to us a good idea to set it on stage in that they were dismantling the set of what she had just performed in. But that was because, we had also thought it was interesting to sort of to arrive to where we were, to actually use the introduction as a way as a theatrical. It started like you saw a girl in a period 16th century dress, actually drinking something, and then you realized you're actually seeing a performance, and then she kept being mobbed by wig and hair people who kept changing. She would go backstage and on stage and backstage and on stage, and you would see her changing, and we just went through a number of iconic operatic characters to take us from 1585, if that's the starting date, to 1930s. It was kind of fun. We went through Don Carlos and Rosencavalier and Traviata and The Merry Widow and whatever it was. And it just took us through. It was reminding about what, because she's also always performing, and because she always takes an assumed identity, a little bit like Tosca, she has something in common, that Tosca's always on, even though you never see Tosca performing a part, she's always performing, and she forgets that she's got real people around her, and she keeps going into the, Emilia Marti has an element of that at times, that she has to perform because people mustn't find out who she is. So there's always an element of that, which is also kind of exhausting, I should think, as well, to keep your identity hidden, because nobody would possibly believe it if you told them. And when, of course, she is obliged to tell them, because push has come to shove and she gets drunk and it all comes out and nobody can actually believe that what she's saying is possible. And that is also an incredible moment, because also I think interesting in terms of making us think that, and that's what so much of literature does, we take what we know to be what's real. And of course, people interested in paranormal science, we don't actually really know anything. So, of course, since life is, the great myths are always about wanting to know more. We were talking about Faust, who wants to know more than he should know, and Don Giovanni, who also, in a way, pushes that same boundary, that envelope further out. But that isn't. These are essential myths that are symbolic of our desire to know more, which is right. We've been somehow programmed that way. If we want to know more, that is why things happen. And in a way, Elena Marti is a kind of a negative version of that, if you like. It's happened to her, and then she goes along with it. But I think that basic human desire to need to know more and to keep going on and to keep is something that's essential to our humanity. And I agree with you, David, also at the end of all these pieces, where the stories do completely vaporize into something that's much more important than any of the human concerns, which are, of course, deeply moving at times, but the actual basic notion of what really counts is love, what really counts are major values that we mustn't lose, like you were saying. And that's what opera uniquely does anyway. And so it's sort of incredible that I hadn't actually thought of it like that each of these pieces has that kind of apotheosis where the story melts away and you're left with it sometimes for a very short moment, this incredibly intense emotion, which he manages somehow to weave together in these really great lyric, extravagant expositions. It's fabulous.
So this piece is so rich that I can imagine you, David Pountney, when you staged it, which was your approach?
Well, I did my Janáček productions in a state of tremendous ignorance. And you know, that's probably the best way to go about it. You know, I really didn't, you know, I had to listen to these pieces quite a bit on records, I suppose, but you know, it wasn't terribly accessible in those days to come and see them here. You know, that was in the communist time and so on, and as a young director, I mean, I started doing these pieces when I was 24 or something. So I just did them, and actually, afterwards, people told me how difficult they were, but actually, when I was doing them, I never noticed that they were difficult, because it always seemed to me to be terribly natural. But I wondered whether one of the things that worries me is that, you know, we're all, in a way, preaching to the converted. And we think Janáček's fabulous, and probably most of you do too. And the fact is that audiences still don't really get it. You know, if we do Janáček in Wales, so there's a terrific tradition of doing Janáček in Wales, and we do Puccini at the same time, the bulk of the audience will go to the Puccini. One of the things that seems to me to be a reason for that is speed. These pieces are so fast, and they're so brutally cut, and they never repeat. You know, and one of the essential things about most successful operas is that, you know, they go over the same thing at least 3 times. So, you know, by the time the 3rd time, the public's got what's going on. You know, but in Janáček, you're already into the next act by the time that's happened. And you know, I think that's, for a director, you know, because the pieces invite you to have a lot of ideas. because they're so theatrically ambitious and exciting. But actually, there isn't time for very many ideas in these pieces if you're going to take the audience with you. And I just wonder what you felt about that.
Well, I think that one of the biggest strengths of Janáček is that he's not sentimental.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely, that's why the last few bars of each of his operas are sort of apotheoses, because he keeps the false sentiment away. He has a lot of feeling, but he never allows himself, or very rarely, to go into sentimentality, sort of, pushing the tears and the emotions. And it's a bit like, I don't know, like Wozzeck. I mean, when at the end of the Wozzeck, it just goes into incredible emotional tumble. What is it called? The tumble...
Dryer.
Tumble dryer, yes. Because he keeps the sentimentality away. And I think that's why also the audience are... I mean, the Czech audience, they don't really like Janáček because they want the Puccini, they want to have a little, and they want really the emotions to, to float around, and that's it. I mean, I think that the audience in England, in Scandinavia, they like Janáček.
Well, I'm introducing a note of caution here because actually statistics would not really agree. We do a lot of Janáček because, Robert and you and me, we're all crazy about it and we think it's important to do it. But the public doesn't really get it in terms of, I think Janáček's the most important 20th century opera composer. But he wouldn't get the audience vote, would he?
Yes, I agree. As a general manager, it's difficult to fill the houses with Janáček. And we did a whole cycle with Robert in Strasbourg, and I can tell you that, for example, to fill the House of the Dead is more difficult than, for example, a contemporary opera we just did about a piece Key West by Coltes, which was a completely new commissioned opera. It was more easy to fill than the House of the Dead. And I think it's due to the rapidity. These pieces are very, very fast. That's true. I think it's difficult to say this in Brno. It's also due to the Czech language. I think I have even had singers, of course not Czech singers, but English-speaking or German-speaking singers who told me, I won't learn a role by Janáček. I offered somebody the role of Prus in Macropolis. I said, no, I can't learn this language. It's so difficult to me. Yeah. So even the singers say this, and it's a bit the same for the audiences, I'm afraid. Yeah,
but it's the same. I mean, Kafka doesn't sell well as well. I mean, the other important Czech in this. I mean, we had Janáček and we had Kafka. Kafka as a writer, Janáček as a composer of operas. I mean, there were no bigger writers or bigger opera composers than these two guys. And they were not Czechs, by the way. Janáček was Moravian and Kafka was German Jew. But I think that you can't make Kafka sell as, what's his name, Dan Brown.
Yeah, of course.
And you can't make Janáček sell as La Bohème. I mean, that's it.
So, it's perhaps the conclusion could be because Janáček was such a visionary man, and that his message is difficult to understand for large audiences. Is that a right conclusion?
I don't know, because on the other hand, you could say, if you think where we were not that long ago, these works weren't being so regularly performed. I mean, Jennifer and Katja are now seem to me to be becoming quite, of course, much more mainstream and becoming works that are no longer, box office poison is exaggerating. That's the phrase, isn't it? But are not works that are. I think people will go to see them, but it's true they don't have the I mean, that's a whole other conversation, because then you're talking about audience expectation and who are the audience anyway, and that is another problem. I think all these points are right, but all we can go on doing is continuing to do the best performances of this that we can do. And I think that the strength and the importance of the works is in itself vindicates or deals with the problem to some degree, in that these works are now being much more regularly performed, all of them, and have quite an impact when they are performed. But it's true, you can't program 16 performances from the House of the Dead that you're not going to make in any size theatre, I wouldn't have thought. But anyway, that's not my job.
And you, David Radok, tomorrow, your Macropolis, are you ready to tell a bit about your concept?
Well, not really, because like always, I'm far away from reaching the ideal translation of Janáček. I mean, I don't know. No, not really, no, because it's some of you might see tomorrow. I mean, it's no point I'll try theoretically to say what I thought in the beginning, because you see a totally different thing tomorrow.
So it's up to everyone's interpretation.
Yeah, I mean, when I heard your description of your production, I was just, I mean, it was the starting point for our work, but of course it didn't succeed again. So, I mean, it's, you know.
But is it naturalistic in setting, or is it abstract, or is it?
Well, okay, I can say. Well, the aim was this. You won't see it tomorrow, but the aim was this. We wanted to start 1924, film a realistic set with film realistic costumes, props and everything. And with Prague, we see Prague, 1924, everything. And then we wanted to, the second act, we're playing it without break, so it goes from the one. The second act is on the stage of Janáček Theatre in Brno, as the sets from Dr. Kolenati's office changes on stage, slowly during the whole second act, into the hotel room, which is a continuing of the story in the theatre, Janáček Theatre in Brno. So it was going to be a sort of a journey in time, and but well, of course, I haven't succeeded again. I'm sorry to say, but it was a try to go through different times. But next time I do it, I'll try to improve it.
So perhaps one of the things we learned here was very right. I think that at the end of nearly all Janáček operas, the story is abandoned to come to a musical apotheosis. And another thing we could say, if I hear all those different opinions on the same works, that the work of Janáček is so rich that it will always stay in a certain way a mystery. It's never clear what he meant, and that makes him so rich. Is that a good conclusion?
Well, it's like actually here, in a way there is, this is not, it's a sort of Mrs. Thatcher school, you ask the question, then you just say, give any old answer. You don't actually answer the question. But I was thinking about what you were saying, David. It is terribly difficult. It's as impossible to put into words what one's trying to do when you've got the thing that's just about to open. And any more than Janáček could probably say what he wanted it to do. I'm not comparing what we do to his act of composition, that you could invent amazingly music from these words, and where does that come from and what is that? But there is an attempt, like any composer, I suppose, through the strange language that is invented, which transcends all the problems of any national barriers of communication. You know, it's Czech, French, English. We're speaking Janáček, and that is something that every one of us is going to understand in a slightly different way, and we're going to understand it differently. It's going to mean something different to every single one of us here. And when you try to make a production, it's an attempt. It's a proposition. I mean, the thing remains what it is, closed on the shelf. And not even then are you sure that the composer knows exactly what he put into it. And that is, of course, the mystery. And that kind of mystery that we celebrate, which I think is unique in Janáček's work, where there is something in... He takes these rather odd situations, the earlier more bourgeois dramas, to use that rather unpleasant phrase, which are set around, women who are betrayed or have secrets. There's always a secret of some sort, I suppose, in Janáček, in a way, to hide. But through that, his celebration of humanity, of course, famously the presence of nature, which is not really present in this work, in the Macropolis case, to such a degree. But there is a strange challenge, I suppose, to himself that he sets himself of wanting to distill something essential, individual, and universal of the human condition. And I mean, that is what opera, that is why we go, what the audiences go for. And it is something which remains always shared because there's a whole audience and there's no theatre without the audience, but is always uniquely personal because no other person can have the same experience that you have. And I think that is really his, one of his great achievements, that there is something incredibly personal about what he does. And very, in a way, open not only to misunderstanding, but maybe to not being understood at all in some of the more extreme cases. But it's not, he also manages to never be, just dry and intellectual and obscure. There is always this, lift-off, and there is always this tapping into the main artery of the emotion that leads to the heart. And that is something, it's just, he probably didn't really have anything to do with it. It's just what he was able to do. And that's amazing.
I thought you said one very interesting thing, which is that there's no nature in Macropolis. And that, of course, is all the more astonishing in that it comes straight out of The Cunning Little Vixen. But actually, the subject of Macropolis is somebody who's been denatured. I mean, that's what's the removal of death from the agenda of Emilia Marti for her 300 years, until the point at which the opera starts, has effectively denatured her, or alienated her from nature. So in a way, he is dealing with nature, but in a sort of obverse way. And I wasn't sure, you said we're not very clear about what he meant. I mean, I think a lot of the time we are very clear about what he meant, actually. I mean, I think of Katya as being an incredibly clearly written piece. I mean, clearly in Macropolis there's this element of, the device of the potion, which is like the device of the potion in any other potion opera, like Tristan or Elisir, you can come to that. It's a device, it's a plot device for enabling something to happen, like in any science fiction thing. But I was wondering if there's an interesting way in which Janáček's process is very important in yielding the result, because we all feel that on one level there is a very there's a clear drama going on, and we all, I think, agree that this clear drama is not enough, that the subject of these pieces is something much, much bigger, and it erupts out of the minutiae of the piece. And, in Macropolis' case, there's a lot of minutiae. There's a lot of chat, and details of this document, that document, so on. And in the end, all of this is blown away and is completely unimportant. And if you think about the way Janáček wrote, I've got 2 pages of a photocopy, of the original autograph score of Macropolis on my wall. And essentially, these are not pieces of music at all. Essentially, they're graphic sculptures. They're just where you can see he's gone through in a sort of white heat of scribbling and scratching and splodging the ink, and there's the most amazing energy put down on this paper. And then he went along with this kind of time bomb of musical energy and expression, and went along to a very nice man who would sit down and make a fair copy and actually try to extract from this ink-blotted landscape a clear musical score. So that right from the very process that he had of composition, this dichotomy is there between a clear story, a clear dramatic structure, and a volcano of energy and emotion underneath that, and waiting to burst out at the right moment in the piece. And I think that's very much our job, is to tell those stories clearly, so that the audience, being hurtled along at this breakneck speed, can cling on and sort of follow the story, but never do anything that stops that explosion from happening. So that when when you need to go big, you can go big.
I think also one thing which is so special about Janáček is that he never follows a convention. I mean, if you look at the purely dramaturgically, if you look at the stories, they are impossible. I mean, any dramaturg would improve the stories, because for example, in the Macropolis case, the first act is about all the things which we can't understand, really. I mean, it took me half a year to understand what it is about, really. And the audience can't, in the 20 minutes, get it. But he doesn't care about it, because he gives the atmosphere of the situation. And there are lots of things which are impossible to play purely instrumentally. I mean, the tempi, if you look at some of the things, how they're written, the musician can't really do it. Some of the lines are so fast that even in Czech, sung by Czechs, it's just like it's a machine gun. And usually it's been sort of improved, like everybody tried to improve Janáček, that they made it a little bit slower, or they finished the line after the orchestra finished, and then the singer finished his line. And in fact, I think that Janáček really was sort of exploding as he was writing, and didn't really follow any given rules.
Could this very energetic and nearly chaotic writing also be due to the fact that he knew that he was already older, and that the time that was left was very little?
I don't know, but I think there's this incredible nervousness, so? And I think there was this nature. I think he was a bit hysterical, a bit, well, maybe not hysterical, but highly emotional person.
Now I will tell Nicholas Payne. Now finally we will speak about Kamila Stoeslova, because Nicholas wrote me a mail and he said, if you manage not to speak Kamila Stoeslova, you deserve a prize, but we won't have this prize. So in the last 15 years of his life, he really fell in love of a woman that was 40 years younger than he was, whom he had only a platonic affair, or even not affair. He wrote her 700 letters, I think, 700, but she stayed a married woman with a businessman in a small village here in the neighborhood. And but this gave, in all those letters, you can see that he tells her that she gave him a new energy in his life, and that, for example, a person like Elena Makropoulos, that she inspires him when he writes music for this Elena Makropoulos. Do you think this was also for him very important, this boost of energy to fall in love with his woman?
Well, I mean, clearly yes, and maybe, I mean, it's strange when you hear that. I remember thinking at the time, that's so odd. What kind of a compliment is that to someone to say, well, you know, you're the inspiration? But in a way, you know, behind Elena Makropoulos, but in a way, I suppose it was the unattainability of her that maybe he was referring to, and this, because of course her coldness is terrible. You know, in the work, what's terrifying is her indifference to death and young people and opportunity. You know, nothing means anything to her anymore. And of course, this would be an inversion of a woman who's so much younger than he is. I mean, I wonder. You know, the eternal, it's a sort of new version of the eternal feminine, isn't it? The Makropoulos case, when you think about it, and what it must have meant to him, this ideal of a woman living forever who would certainly outlive him. I would not actually be able to imagine what it meant, but there must have been a lot of things in there, and she certainly was a huge inspiration. Maybe the fact that he couldn't actually, you know, achieve her in that way remained a constant somehow goal and something that kept him going.
Because Elena Makropoulos is very cold with the men also. She was often compared to Lulu for that also. She treats the men around her in a very cold way, and when Proust has a love night with her, he's very disappointed.
Well, yes, in our production, the show that she was actually performing in the second act was Turandot, because I thought that was a sort of an appropriate equivalent for her, but also it so happened to have the premiere the same year as the Makropoulos case. And then they took all her Turandot costumes, and she looked a bit like Lulu. But no, it's true. That's what I was saying. I think it was an odd thing for him to write to her. That how would you take that if you received that? Because the character is not. But there is something deeply moving about Elena Makropoulos, which she herself is not. In spite of herself, this humanity comes out of this monster, you know, this girl whose fault it is not that she's lived so many of these lives and has become so indifferent to every form of normal human exchange and behavior that whatever happens, she doesn't care, because in a way, nothing means anything to her anymore. And she's seen it all. You know, she has her great-great-great-grandson in love with her, or whatever she ends up with. That's quite difficult to figure out who is who as well, isn't it? Which relation to her is now making love to her? I mean, it gets so confused because everyone who sees her just falls instantly in love with her. And maybe there's that parallel for him as well.
Well, I think I'm a bit skeptical about the whole Camilla thing. And I think that if she hadn't existed, he would have had to invent her. And I think she's just another opera, really, going on in his life. And I think she's part of this furnace of discovery that he is as a 50-year-old man in the last 25 years of his life. You know, when suddenly it all starts to happen for him. And of course he needs a kind of erotic outlet as well. And you know, maybe he subconsciously, deliberately kept her at arm's length. I suspect that too. And I think he just needed somewhere to put all this rampant emotion and creativity and energy. And I do really think that the political future of the Czech lands was also incredibly inspiring to him. But you know, he was a tempestuous and difficult person. He was horrid to his wife. You know, he was not a nice...
He lost 2 children also with her. He lost 2 children.
And he treated her very badly. I mean, he was not a nice person, but why should he be a nice person just because he's a great composer? You know, that's a kind of rather sentimental view, isn't it? And I think that Camilla is just a psychologically invented necessity as part of the armory of emotional excitement that he feels that he needs at this incredibly fruitful part of his life. And her individual, you know, actually she wasn't even very good looking, was she?
No.
So now we talked about Camilla Sturslova. You told me also to stop after an hour. We are over an hour now. So thank you very much for this very interesting debate, and thanks to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you.